Lies and cheating. That was how I got into the industry. I was on the poverty line, and so I went to a firm called Firebird, and I said to them, look, I'm an experienced programmer, know all about games and things. Have you got any work?
Throughout his storied career, the legendary game developer Peter Molyneux has been considered a liar and a cheat by many, including, in that 1995 interview, himself. And while he has certainly given us plenty of reasons to doubt his motives, I think, at the very least, that his record of innovative game design and commitment to player freedom has earned him the right to a fair and reasonable assessment. Because the truth of Peter Molyneux's story is not quite as black and white as much of the Populous would lead you to believe. It's a strange fable, the tale of an entrepreneur burdened with curiosity and the dream of making games that make God us. A man who admits that he got where he wanted to be by lying and cheating is clearly not going to join the priesthood anytime soon. But that doesn't mean he's an outright bad guy either. After all, the phrase "fake it till you make it" has been considered an apparently good piece of advice for as long as I can remember. Maybe it's fair to suggest then that a little exaggeration here and a minor fib there is not such a bad thing, but life is full of moral quandaries which sometimes aren't even apparent to us in the moment, and the smallest lies can sometimes have the most harmful, long-lived effects. Let's imagine, for example, that someone with significantly more video game making experience had turned up at Firebird an hour after Molyneux, also looking for work, only to find that they had just missed out. Then again, nobody ever said that life was meant to be fair, so maybe what matters most is simply intention. Maybe faking it till you make it exists on a scale, from trying to be more confident to becoming a villainous conman. Some people are tellers of tall tales, and some people are simply swindlers. So which one is Peter Molyneux, really? After jumping from controversy to controversy, where has he landed on that scale? What can his games, from Populous to Fable to Masters of Albion, tell us about the man and his morals? And what exactly made this man who found a way to make himself God?
I read this short story, and I think it was by Ray Bradbury. And it was a short story of this family that had this little house with these little characters in them. They cared for these little characters. And in the end, the little characters turned on the family and killed them horribly. I have always remembered the feeling of what it would have been like to have this little world that you controlled.
In that 2017 interview with IGN's Ryan McCaffrey, Peter Molyneux discusses his original source of inspiration for designing the 1989 game Populous, which is widely considered to be the first God game, a genre broadly defined by allowing the player to have control over the game's world and its people with godlike powers. This one short story then played a crucial role in inspiring the boy who would become the man who would invent a way to play God. That short story is, incidentally, Housing Problem, written by Henry Kuttner and featured in this Ray Bradbury edited collection of sci-fi tales. I know this because after some time trawling the internet to find a story that matched Molyneux's description, I then sent an email to 22 Cans HQ to ask them if they could ask Peter if this was in fact the story he was referring to. Thankfully, they replied pretty swiftly to tell me that, after looking online to confirm, Peter had answered, and I quote, "Yes, I think it was." It's worth noting too that shortly after receiving that reply, Peter Molyneux repeated this story in an interview with Eurogamer, offering essentially the same details as in that IGN clip. The plot of Housing Problem is not exactly as Molyneux described it, but I don't think you can honestly begrudge someone for misremembering the details of a story they read as an impressionable young child. While this story was clearly important to Molyneux, it was probably less about the words on the page and more about the ideas it presented, and so he wrote his own ending in his head, which is honestly probably better than the one in the actual book. The story itself revolves around a nosy, unremarkable couple who rent a room in their home to Mr. Henchard, a reclusive older gentleman who keeps a mysterious birdcage covered with a cretan cloth by his window. When Mr. Henchard goes away for a week, the owners soon work up the courage to venture into his room and remove the cloth, under which they discover a tiny house inside the birdcage, exhibiting signs of life from within. The curious pair continue to visit the tiny house, poking and prodding at the building and attempting to peek through the windows at the creatures inside as they try to live their tiny lives. My favourite details in this story, by the way, are the headlines on the tiny newspapers which are mysteriously delivered to the pixie house, including such gems as Extra, Fotzba moves on tour. Eventually, the couple irritate the pixies so much that they move out of the tiny house before their caretaker can return from his trip. Mr. Henchard is understandably furious at learning this, and swiftly decides to move out so he can craft a new, better pixie house. I'm sure that with some effort you could morph the content of this story into a worthy metaphor for the nature of gaming and game development in general. Maybe a developer builds their little pixie house and then hopes that the player will take care of it, with the pixies representing some sort of ineffable qualities of the game. Perhaps it's the nosy couple who could represent the player, poking and prodding at a game until the pixies leave and the magic is gone. Or what if the pixies are the player, moving into the tiny game house and bringing the magic with them, or not? I'm not personally convinced that any of those readings quite work, but I do think that Mr. Henchard, the master craftsman, is a nice parallel to Peter Molyneux, the god game designer, building his little worlds full of pixies and leaving them in the hands of the player to be kind or cruel and face the consequences either way. Housing Problem is a weird story about good luck charms and keeping your nose out of other people's business, but it makes sense that Molyneux would focus in on what is by far the most interesting element in the story: the little people in their tiny house. He has also extrapolated his own moral quandary from the tale. The simple question of how would you treat these people if you were in charge? What would you be like if you were their god? This concept would go on to form the foundations of Populous, a game developed by Peter Molyneux through his company Bullfrog Productions and published by Electronic Arts. Populous made players into gods, allowing them to sculpt the land and grow or destroy their digital miniature societies, and the game would prove to be a huge success. 6 years and many games later, Bullfrog was acquired by EA while Peter Molyneux became a vice president at the company, a role which left him with less and less time to actually work on games. Eventually, in 1997, shortly after the release of Dungeon Keeper, Peter Molyneux parted ways with the company, citing frustration working with EA post-acquisition, and wanting to focus again purely on designing games. Molyneux founded Lionhead Studios, where they swiftly got to work on making Black and White. Published in 2001, it marked the release of yet another critically acclaimed god game for the man behind the genre. And it's at this point where you might start to wonder whether the man who some dubbed God of God games might have been developing a bit of a god complex. He probably wasn't omniscient as far as we know, but he was revered by many, and with good reason, I think. It seems pretty clear that Molyneux knows how to make great games, even if his track record is far from flawless. It is, in fairness, impossible to calculate the extent of his involvement in every project he's ever been credited on, and he's clearly worked with a lot of very talented developers too. But there is still ample evidence proving that he was the driving force behind multiple innovative and unique games. And besides that, a very clear through line runs through Peter Molyneux's body of work, recalling that strange story that he read as a young boy, giving players the power to choose whether they want to be good or evil.
I've always been fascinated by morals, about what is good and what is evil and what's right and what's wrong, and how some societies can view one thing as being perfectly okay and others can view other things as not okay. And giving people the power to do what they want to do inside a game, I've been absolutely fascinated with.
Is a lie really a lie if the so-called liar believed it to be true when it was said? Or, in other words, if a man says that his game will allow the player to have children, but then in order to release the game on time he has to remove that feature, does that mean he was being dishonest or simply speaking out of turn in his excitement over the potential that the game had to offer? How do you, morally, feel about a man who has repeatedly misrepresented the truth, even if his intentions weren't necessarily immoral? Whichever way you look at Peter Molyneux and his career, he's right to point out himself that his creative work has always revolved around morality itself, even when his own ethics have repeatedly been called into question. This was certainly the case after the release of Lionhead's second game, 2004's Fable, the first story in the now legendary franchise which most would consider Peter Molyneux to be the face of. It is interesting to note, however, that Peter is not in fact credited with originating the franchise itself. That honour goes to Simon and Dean Carter, who developed the original concept with a small team that originally functioned as a subsidiary of Lionhead, before merging into the company. Peter Molyneux was certainly involved from early on, though it's hard to tell how involved and at what point he became more actively focused on the game. Either way, it's clear that he loved Fable. While he claims he never thought Populous would be a success, he repeatedly stated that Fable was going to be the greatest game of all time, and I don't think that was just salesmanship. Along with making broad claims about the game's overall greatness, though, Molyneux also made some very specific claims, which would eventually backfire spectacularly when they ultimately did not align with the final product. He famously claimed that players would be able to plant an acorn and watch it grow into an oak tree over the course of the game, for example, as well as being able to have children, and neither of these features were present in the release version of Fable. The game was still genuinely fantastic, but some people, understandably, felt that they had been a little bit cheated when they sat down to play the game and found themselves incapable of producing digital offspring. I won't attempt to account for everything Molyneux said about the game which turned out not to be true, but suffice it to say that while some of the things he said were very specific, a lot of it boils down to general exaggeration about the extent of player choice in the game. I'm hesitant then to call any of these claims lies, because, like Sean Murray after him, I want to believe that he meant for it all to be true. And I also think that the reason Molyneux talked so excitedly about things like planting an acorn or reproducing is because those are some of the things that excited him most about the game. None of that lets him off the hook, but they are important qualifications, I think. Fable was not the first game that didn't live up to the hype, and it certainly wasn't the last either. And it definitely wasn't a scam. It was not a hastily assembled, tedious mess. It was a really great game. But it wasn't perfect, and it wasn't exactly the game that Peter Molyneux had suggested it would be. Throughout his career, Molyneux has been known to oversell his games in much the same way, though to varying extents. In Fable 2, they finally worked out how to let the player have children, and that's great. But I also remember Molyneux claiming that these children would grow up and have their own lives. And while they could age a little, they never actually grew into adults like people were expecting. That's just one example. And then, with Fable 3, it's clear that a truncated development schedule had an even more dramatic effect on the final product versus Molyneux's promises. The weapons that were supposed to evolve through gameplay were incredibly unimpressive. Player NPC interactions were supposed to be dramatically upgraded but felt lacking. And while he claimed that the second half of the game would give the player tactical control over their kingdom in every possible way, it ended up offering a watered down series of decisions that didn't actually take that long to play through. For what it's worth, I still personally love Fable 3, and I think it does some things which were genuinely brilliant then and remain unmatched today. I could talk at great length about the game's strengths, but regardless, it's obviously a compromised product. And Molyneux, in this case, is obviously aware of that, because he's talked at length in interviews about how Fable 3 fell short of what he wanted it to be. In many ways, the section of the game where you become king should have been the ultimate integration of the god game aspects that Molyneux was known for into the Fable franchise. Though in fairness, all of the Fable games do include elements of the pixies in the house concept, whether through managing properties, nurturing or neglecting the population, or otherwise making tricky moral decisions. I would actually argue that these are the aspects which make the Fable experience so unique. You can buy every house and raise or lower the rent. You can dance with one villager and growl at another. You can choose to build an orphanage or a house of ill repute. You're not an omnipotent god, but the fate of the world is definitely in your hands. Still, while I enjoyed the king section of Fable 3, it was clearly meant to go so much further, and it's not surprising that Molyneux was disappointed with the way it came out. For every feature that he publicly spoke about which didn't come to pass, I imagine there were 100 more ideas that never stood a chance of making it into the final game. A fable, by definition, is a story designed to convey a moral, but it is also inherently a falsehood, an exaggerated tale imparting its specific lesson. A fabler, then, is one who invents such fables and falsehoods. And, in a sense, Peter Molyneux has been a fabler all his life. In interviews, it seems like he cares more about telling a good story than he does about getting the details right. And when discussing his past, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. People don't want to hear every boring detail, and it's often perfectly reasonable to obfuscate certain details in a story, so most of us regularly do. I could tell you, for example, that I picked up Fable 2 on day 1, then started and finished the game in under a week, and you might assume from my phrasing that I was playing it in release week, even though it actually took me a week before I was able to start the game. There's nothing especially harmful about missing out such trivial details when they're not pertinent to the topic at hand. Such omissions do mean, however, in combination with contradictions, that when talking about Peter Molyneux's life, I don't think we can ever confidently declare how things went down or what he was thinking. But regardless, the truthfulness of the minute details he's shared about his life don't really matter. It's not affecting the consumer, and it's not misselling anything when he talks about his past. Equally, I think there are grey areas where his overeager exaggerations could be deceitful, but they aren't directly misrepresenting a product. Project Milo, for example, was a weird Lionhead Kinect experiment which made it look like you could interact with an AI-powered child in revolutionary ways. But it was ultimately just a tech demo. It wasn't a game that was eventually sold, so no one was tricked into spending money on it, but you could argue that this was a ploy to sell more Kinect stuff based on the promise of what was still to come for the platform. I still think that Molyneux's exaggerations about Fable were more ethically questionable, though, as some people were arguably paying for the product under false pretenses. But in the end, it's impossible to know quite how many people felt genuinely cheated by Molyneux's salesmanship. There are plenty of players who were upset that they couldn't grow an acorn into an oak tree. But it's unlikely that anyone bought the game just for that feature, or if they did, were unable to obtain a refund. Either way, as Molyneux eventually ventured bravely into the world of mobile games, crowdfunding, and microtransactions, the mere potential for villainous behaviour certainly ramped up significantly.
In entertainment, so often I'm asked to empathise with the good guy. Personally, I empathise with the bad guy. I always think in James Bond movies, you know, that poor evil dude who set up his base in some volcano. I mean, the employment problems he must have to get staff must be terrible.
Much like a certain Bond villain that Peter Molyneux empathises with, he's had to rebuild his empire and hire his specialised team a couple of times over. 2 years after the release and less than positive reception of Fable 3, and shortly before the release and significantly less than positive reception of the Kinect game Fable The Journey, Molyneux once again left a studio he had founded to form a new one, this time called 22 Cans. And it's at this point when it's sensible to wonder whether Peter has some serious commitment issues when it comes to game development situations. In both cases, he had apparently wanted to start afresh in order to make games without the studio growing too large. That goal likely fell by the wayside at Lionhead because their games were simply too good and too popular. But at 22 Cans, Molyneux would be a lot more successful at keeping his team small by instead focusing on making games that are critically maligned and a lot less profitable. The name 22 Cans actually served as a bit of a mission statement, in that Peter's intention was to have just 22 employees. It's a little bit disappointing to learn then that at the time of this 2024 Eurogamer article, the company had only 20 employees, while not simultaneously having 2 open positions on their website. I suppose it would be a lot to ask that they rename the company every time someone is hired or leaves the studio. But if they're looking for suggestions to bring that number back up to 22, I have to believe that the public relations or Molyneux wrangling department could certainly use a few more hands. 22 Cans' first release was famously Curiosity, the experimental game where millions of players worldwide tapped away at a giant cube trying to answer the simple question of what's inside. Unfortunately, it turned out that what was inside the cube was actually just more disappointment and controversy. The short version of this strange story is that Molyneux, unsurprisingly, dramatically oversold the prize at the centre of this game, which was actually just some vague position of power in a game they hadn't finished yet, and a cut of the profits which never came. That game was Goddess, a a spiritual successor to Populous, which was funded partly through Kickstarter and would be mired in controversy for years, mostly for failing to deliver what they had promised to those early backers, as is, of course, traditional on Kickstarter. The promised online features, for example, including the Curiosity Prize winners' in-game online godlike status, would never be implemented in Goddess. Apparently, they simply couldn't get any of it to work. It pains me somewhat to tell you then, given how much of a horrendous disaster the launch of Goddess was, that the game in 2024 is actually extremely entertaining. Though it's no longer available on Steam, Goddess on mobile is still receiving updates in 2024, and these include new content as well as bug fixes. I downloaded the game with extremely low expectations, and I quickly found myself addicted. In so many ways, Goddess is a legitimately great god game, evolving Populous for the modern age. The core land sculpting mechanic is a bit fiddly, but really uniquely engaging too, and there's a lot of depth in the way you slowly expand your little settlement, and the intention of the online multiplayer feature to add a feeling of competition is well achieved by the inclusion of a competing village full of little people who regularly mock your villagers and will even steal them away if you don't keep them happy enough. Still though, it's hard to love a game which feels like it's trying to swindle you out of significantly more money than it's worth. And Goddess on mobile definitely has some very predatory monetization. It's not dramatically worse than any other microtransaction heavy mobile game, but it still troubles me enough that I'm hesitant about recommending the game overall. Paying a small amount to remove the ads, which are egregious and intrusive, is one thing, and Goddess definitely still functions and is very playable without having to pay any extra. But any game where a player has the option to spend hundreds or thousands on in-game currency to speed up timers will never sit right with me, because some people will do that when caught up in the game and eventually go on to seriously regret it. That said, 22 Cans' even less defensible monetization arguably came with the more recent release of Legacy, a game which apparently made millions through the sale of NFTs integrated into gameplay. And while questionable ethics are the norm with mobile game monetization, it's more difficult to know exactly how immoral these NFT sales were, given that there were almost certainly plenty of people who sincerely believed that they represented sound investments. And it's possible that Molyneux could have believed that too. It would require a lot more investigation to figure out whether Legacy was intended to be a good game or just a scheme. It doesn't sit right with me, but frankly, I'm also wary of digging into it anymore. A year after Legacy's release, in July of 2024, Peter Molyneux took to the stage with Jeff Keighley to reveal his new game, Masters of Albion, which would not be on mobile or NFT based, but rather is intended to be a return to form, and the game which Molyneux hopes will secure his legacy, because obviously Legacy wasn't going to secure his legacy. Truly, I hope this game will be brilliant, and from the brief glimpse they've showed off, I actually think it has the potential to get there, by cleverly combining all the greatest parts of all of Molyneux's greatest games. It has the charming world of Albion, legally distinct from Fables but still basically taken from Fable. It has those godlike powers, combining the best bits of Populous, Black and White, and Goddess. And it has the option to take control of individual characters, like in Dungeon Keeper. Plus, presumably, there's a cube somewhere in the world filled with false promises. With a team of just 20 people, it's clear that Masters of Albion is more on the indie developer side of things than Fable ever was. But that doesn't mean the game can't become something just as great as Fable. Molyneux's studio has certainly set some very lofty goals, and I really hope they reach them. If nothing else, it is promising to see that Molyneux has toned down his grand sweeping statements and overeager promises, and has instead just shown off what they have of the game already. He finally seems to understand how his tall tales have affected his reputation and the reception of his games, and is making every effort to avoid repeating those mistakes. There are many people who have good reasons to loathe Molyneux, and many more whose trust he has lost for good, and I would never wish to minimize their feelings or brush aside their experiences with his games. If I had backed Goddess on Kickstarter, or if I was the Curiosity Prize winner who never got his prize, I'm sure I would not be quite so sympathetic to Peter Molyneux. Personally, the more interviews I've watched and the more stories I've read about his life and his games, the more conflicted I've become. I wanted to believe that his love for making games and his excitement over innovating in those experiences simply led him to share details long before they were anywhere near finalized. In that case, his career might offer a cautionary tale well summarized by a single statement. By all means, reach for the stars, but don't tell everyone you already reached them last week. That said, there are more than a few instances where it becomes much harder to defend his statements as merely jumping the gun, where he has discussed features and specifics so close to release dates, for example, that he must surely have known they wouldn't make it into the final game, where he comes across less as an excited game designer and more like a willingly ignorant snake oil salesman. It's difficult to deny his inherent proclivity for less than ethical salesmanship, and many of the tales he's told of his own life only contribute further to the image some people have in their heads of Peter Molyneux constantly spewing lies. In the end, then, I don't believe that Peter Molyneux is a bad guy, but I'm pretty sure he's no saint either. He's a man who empathizes with the villain, a man who lied and cheated his way into the games industry. A man who is fascinated by what people deem morally wrong or right, and how societal context can change that paradigm. He's a man who has spent his life seeking to realize the fantasy of having godlike control over a little world. And a man who, for all his faults, loves making games. Just like in those games, Peter Molyneux and everyone else on the planet will be judged and shaped and face consequences based on the moral choices they make in life. And while Molyneux's choices may not have been wholly bad, he has repeatedly witnessed the undesirable results of making choices he probably knew weren't right and saying things he probably knew he shouldn't have. So maybe the most important lesson that any of us can take away from Peter Molyneux is that it's safest to avoid talking in the future tense wherever possible, because what's coming is never entirely in our control, and I will too often becomes I couldn't. If you enjoyed this video, please do like and share, and subscribe if you want to see more just like it. Otherwise, I'll see you next time around.